All right, so here's the deal. You've been introduced to what we call a quadratic function. It's y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, right? And there's these numbers that go in for a, b, and c. Now, we've also talked a little bit about the graph of one of these. Now, first off, the graph of one of these has a special name. And I'm going to be kind of particular in how you say it. It's a parabola. We pronounce that parabola, not parabola, parabola. It's not a disease, so don't make it sound like one. And so when we graph it, we call it a parabola. And when you graph a parabola, we've already kind of talked about this also, there's two looks to it, and there's only going to be two looks. One, it could look like a U, and the other one, it could look like a rainbow. Another thing we've talked about is how a parabola is the same on both sides, which is called symmetric, kind of like a butterfly or a heart. If you fold it in half, you're going to be making the same thing on both sides. They match up. And so in class, we talked a little bit about this folding line, is what we called it. This actually has a specific name, and that's called the axis of symmetry. So if we draw this imaginary line, we usually use dots to draw the imaginary line. Because when you do dots, you're saying it's not really there, but visually it's nice to see it there, but it's not really part of our graph. So when we draw those lines down the middle, this line down the middle where it folds is called the axis of symmetry. Okay, so that yellow line there on both of them is called your axis of symmetry. It's the line down the middle. And when you're graphing a parabola, it's really, really helpful to know where your axis of symmetry is, because then you can easily, do the dots on both sides so that they match up. And so you only really have to find a couple points, because then you can just flip them over that line of symmetry and have the other point. So finding the axis of symmetry is actually pretty easy. It's a vertical line, and if you remember when we talk about vertical lines, we're saying, hey, the y value can be anything. So, right, let's say I'm over here on this line right here, the y value can be anything. It's going up and down all over the place, but it's always staying at the same x value. So the x value is always the same. So what's interesting about that is to find the axis of symmetry, we're going to use x equals, because it's going to be the equation of a line, and we're going to have a number over here on this side. Sometimes it's x equals 2, sometimes it's x equals -1, sometimes it's x equals 0, but we're going to have a number there. And to find that number, we have this little formula, and that little formula is -b, b as in the number here on the equation, so the number in front of x, over 2 times a is in the number in front of x squared. Now I want to point out there's already a negative here, so if you are doing this and b here happens to be negative, that means you're going to have a negative of a negative, and it'll cancel out to be positive. So just be very careful with your negatives. Make sure you show that, and you show your cancelizations if they happen. So that's going to be the axis of symmetry, and I'll show you an example here in a second. But we also have to find something else that we called in class, we call that a vertex. Okay, so the vertex is the very top or the very bottom of your parabola. It all depends on what kind of parabola you have. For this one on the left here, my vertex is this point right here at the very bottom of the parabola. That was a really big point, wasn't it? I didn't mean to make it that big, but it's that very, very middle point. On this one, it happens to be the lowest one. On the one on the right, it's the very middle point that happens to be the highest point on this. Now, if you can imagine, this is actually really quite a useful point. If you think about, let's say, this one on the right here represents something jumping up in the air. This spot right here is going to be how high it got. And so this could be a very useful point for us to find. Now, if you look at both of these points, they're both on the axis of symmetry, which means we already know the x value. Because we already know the x value on every point on this line, and it's whatever we got over here. So we're going to use that to help us find this actual full point, because remember, we have a point now that's going to be x comma y. And we already know our x point from right there. And so then the question always is how do I find the y value? Well, don't forget, we are given this equation right here, and there's the y value. So if we know what x is, we can plug it in, do the math, and it'll tell us the y value. So let's look at an example. All right, so let's say we have the quadratic equation y equals x squared plus, I'm just going to make it simple, 2x, let's go with a minus 1. All right, so this is going to be a parabola because I know that because I have x squared as my biggest exponent, so it's going to be a parabola. And I start by finding my axis of symmetry, and that would be x equals negative b over 2a. So as I do my formula, I know the negative has to be there, and I know the 2 has to be there, right? And so then I look for b. Remember, this is a in front of x squared, b in front of x, and c is our constant. So b here is 2. It's a positive 2, so I'll put just a 2 in there, and I already have the negative from the formula. And then the rest of my formula says I have it 2 times a on the bottom. Now a is a number in front of x squared. If you look here, x squared doesn't have anything in front of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a number there. And remember, whenever we need to put a number, a placeholder, we put a 1 there. And so technically a is just 1. So then I do my math. On top I have negative 2. On bottom I have 2 times 1 is 2. Negative 2 divided by positive 2 is negative 1. So my axis of symmetry is x equals negative 1. So if I was going to draw this parabola out, I would have my xy axis. I have x equals negative 1, and so I'd put a dotted line here at negative 1. Okay, that's going to be the center of the parabola. That's where the parabola is going to be centered at. And then my next step is to find that vertex. Remember, the vertex is that point on this dotted line here. So I have this dotted line. The x value here is always negative 1. So if my vertex is on this line, then that means the vertex value is negative 1. So if I go back to my equation here, I want to figure out what is the y value when x is negative 1. So I'm going to plug negative 1 in for both of these x's. Okay, so I go ahead and write it out. Y equals, I'm not going to write the 1, but I have x squared, and so the x squared, so let me just write the equation without any plugging in. So what I'm doing is I'm writing the equation exactly as is, but whenever I have an x here, I'm writing a bubble. And then I've decided that my x value is negative 1, because any point on that line is negative 1. So I plug in negative 1. Now it's really important that we use our parentheses here, because I am squaring, in the problem, I'm squaring x, and x happens to be a negative number, so I need those parentheses to make sure that that squared is squaring that negative also. So a negative 1 squared means negative 1 times negative 1, which is a positive 1. So y equals 1, and then 2 times negative 1 is minus 2, and then we've got a minus 1. So 1 minus 2 is negative 1, minus 1 is negative 2. So my y value is negative 2. So remember what we just did. We plugged in negative 1 for x. We got a y value of negative 2. So I'm going to put my point right there. And that's pretty much all we're going to talk about right now for axis of symmetry and vertex for graphing a parabola. We're going to work more on graphing other parabolas later, but this is basically it. I have just one more little thing I want to show you. If your equation was y equals, let's say 2x squared minus 3, a lot of times people get a little freaked out by this one, because if you remember, my axis of symmetry is x equals negative b over 2a. Now a is a number in front of x squared, so that's pretty easy. That's just a 2. And then b is that number in front of x. But if you look at our equation, there is no x. And the only way you can get rid of x is if you had an x and the number in front was a 0. Because 0 times anything is just 0, and then we don't have to write it in our equation if it's 0. So if there's no x, that means that the b value was 0. So we're just going to plug in 0. And what's cool about that, remember how cool the number 0 is 0 divided by anything, it doesn't matter, we're just going to get 0. So x equals 0 then would be the axis of symmetry, which would mean x equals 0 is right here on the y-axis. So that means the y-axis is our axis of symmetry. So the center of our parabola then is on the y-axis. So if that happens, it'll be okay. You just have to, plug in 0 and go from there.